The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time. Now we're in book 2, so we'll call it The Great Hunt podcast. I am, of course, Greg, your host who knows very little, and I am joined by Tylor, your host who knows quite a lot. Tylor, how are things?
Things are very well. It's actually nice to have those descriptors go in that direction, and pretty much anything other than Wheel of Time, I think you would be the one who knows a lot. So I'm feeling pretty good at this very moment. And as I mentioned in the last episode, we're starting to get into the section of this book that I am actually really excited to read instead of slightly dreading reading. So this is where I start to get a little bit more enthusiastic about things going forward. I was just going to ask you, did you see a big change in quality? Did you notice the difference, or was I hyping you up all of this time for nothing?
I noticed that we were not with Rand, and I was like, that's all he meant. He just wanted to get away from Rand. But no, I will say I'm excited to talk about both of these chapters, but particularly the second one excited me and felt I don't know that I want to say it felt very different, but that's certainly not a negative. Just felt again like one of these chapters that we're really expanding and drawing something else in. So so it was really exciting. I'm curious to see how much we have to talk about because, as we always say, the plot heavy ones, there's not as much to talk about sometimes. And it felt like these were more plotty, but exciting things. So my fear is that bad episodes of the show are the Chris Farley show sketch where it's like, do you remember that thing Moiraine did? It's like, yeah, that was awesome.
It was great. Yeah.
And so maybe that's all we need to be when it's those chapters, and maybe that's what people enjoy. But, I think it is exciting to be moving into the back half of this book. And percentage wise, according to my reading app, we are now in the back half of this book.
Well, in that case, why don't we just get started with the back half of this book? Because every chapter we go forward means we're one closer to the really, really good stuff. So we'll begin today with chapter 22, Watchers, which begins with a very un-Moiraine sentence when she says, "Nothing is happening as I expect." She has gone to a small town seemingly hidden in the middle of nowhere where two retired Aes Sedai have sort of made their study, and she is going through a large number of papers and documents when Lan comes in. She initially starts the conversation by asking him about when they met, and we get just a little bit of kind of glimpses of how they originally met. There was apparently a dunking in a lake and ants and all sorts of other hijinks. Don't worry, we'll read about it in a prequel in like 7 or 8 books. After that happens, we then have a discussion where Moiraine reveals that she is going to pass Lan's bond onto another Aes Sedai in the event that she dies, and that if she does pass, Lan will immediately be compelled to join who we eventually learn is Myrelle, a Aes Sedai of the Green Aja. After that, I think Moiraine finally kind of executes the plan she's had the entire time. She asks Lan why he gave Rand all of the advice that he did and why he seems to be acting differently. And Lan at first is kind of defensive, says it's just ta'veren, or says it could just be his willingness to protect. But Moiraine clearly believes that it is Nynaeve that is causing all of these issues. And Lan kind of leaves clearly frustrated. It's obvious that Moiraine was kind of trying to poke the bear and get his defenses down a bit. At this point, Moiraine is joined by Vandine, one of the two Aes Sedai who are in this cabin, and Moiraine starts asking a series of questions of Vandine, trying to clarify some of the things that she has been researching. So first, she asks about any link between the Dragon Reborn and the Horn of Valir. She asks about a link between the Dragon Reborn and Toman Head. She asks about Shadar Lagath, and then finally, she asks about the Forsaken and more specifically Lanfear. We get a few kind of hints at answers, but nothing super detailed or specific. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, there are some Dragcar, and Lan kills one, and it almost kills Moiraine. And the chapter ends with Moiraine saying she thinks she actually learned the thing she needed to know. She just can't remember what question she was asking when she did. And that is where we leave this chapter, which I think you're right to say a lot of plot happens, but I actually had this as the chapter with a lot more detail and notes on things I wanted to talk about because it read to me as a bit more character focused, even though a lot happens. Now that you possibly remember what happened here, I know it's been a while since you went straight upstairs and read it last week. What was your impression of this? What I think of as a kind of rare treat, a Moiraine chapter.
Yeah, so again, I think my one role as the guy who knows nothing is like telling you what this reminds me of, has slowly become my role all the time. And this is very much the portion of Fellowship of the Ring where Gandalf disappears for a while and goes and looks in all the stacks in Gondor and all over to learn figure out if it could possibly be the ring that Bilbo had. And so this feels like that, right? So we get the very similar character. We get the Moiraine who is ahead of everybody else and goes off seeking the knowledge she needs. It certainly sets a clear tone when it starts with the sentence it does. And this idea again that, it really reminded me of the moment when the kind of ghost showed up at the end of book 1 and it was like, oh no, like she wasn't expecting this and this changes everything. Ghost, undead guy, that guy.
Yeah, one of the Forsaken. Yeah.
One of the Forsaken. And so I think that was really exciting. And I'm going to skip entirely over the bulk of the chapter to the last line I noted in my notes is really, I felt, I liked it, but it felt like Robert Jordan showing off because he's like, I just told you something important and you don't know what it is. And very much that she's just, Moiraine is describing herself, but that it's also like, hey, you just got a big hint of what you need. Try to figure out what it was. And I think, it could be read cynically as showing off, but I think it's more playful in this sense, or at least that's how I took it.
I think you are correct in saying that it is Robert Jordan showing off, and I was so busy relating to how accurate that feeling is that I didn't notice it at all until just this moment. It just felt real to me, and so I didn't kind of take on anything being wrong about it. I'm curious, at what point in this chapter did you kind of figure out that Moiraine had an overall plan in her conversation with Lan? Because it seems to me we start the chapter, as you say, with her being in over her head, which is a thing I think we've maybe only seen once before in the series. But then immediately as you start reading through this chapter, it becomes apparent she knows everything she's doing to Lan and how it's leading him to eventually revealing what she needs to know. So I'm curious whether that worked for you, kind of her starting seemingly so over her head and then immediately having a perfectly executed plan that went off without a hitch.
Yeah, it felt very much to me. I think the film term is a rack focus, right? Is that where the camera stays still, but you pull from one to the other? I think, yeah. So it felt very much like that. It's like, she was working on the large scale, like far distant, all the things going on, and then pulled her focus tight. And then, when focused on Lan, could start to piece out, okay, why'd you do this? Why did we do this? Maybe now's the moment. I had some questions about, there's some kind of curious mythology here.
Oh, yes.
Particularly the bond and how, so without Lan's consent or knowledge, she has made it so that the bond will transfer to the seat once Moiraine dies.
Not to the seat, to a different Aes Sedai. Morel
Oh,
Sedai is the one who
Morel.
is
Oh,
going
okay.
to receive. And then she also says later on in the conversation that Morel has been instructed to find an Aes Sedai who would be a good fit to then have a second transfer without Lan's consent to another Aes Sedai who then would be bonded to. And there is a moment in this section where Lan is very specifically like, you have told me in the past you think this is unethical. Why did you do it? And her answer is basically like, well, the greater good. And yeah, it's icky. It's real icky.
Yeah. Well, and I think in my head I really bumped on that because I was married not to Nynaeve Lan. I think those are destined to never be together lovers, but to his narrative about becoming king again and putting up the banners and rallying the people. And I was like, wait, are we purposely trying to prevent that story from happening, or is it, just that Moiraine has never cared about that story? I mean, it's not that like Lan wants that story to happen at the moment. When that mythology was introduced, it was like, well, that has to be where his story is going eventually, or else why else do it? So I was surprised at that relationship kind of superseding, or relationship is an icky way to say it, but that and then I'm also if this were a different book, that would feel like heraldry and chivalry, like you are duty bound. But I assume that's actually magic, that he is bonded in some way that he can't break that bond voluntarily at all.
That is correct to the second point. To your first, I think Moiraine actually gives us some interesting context on this, because when they're arguing about whether or not it's ethical to compel him to go to Morel or to pass the bond, one of the things that Moiraine says is that she doesn't want Lan wasting his life avenging her, which I think feels perfectly in line with what we've seen of Lan. But then her second explanation is she doesn't want to see Lan immediately after her death more or less commit suicide by rejoining the war in the Blight, right? Malkier has fallen to the Blight. And so this, I think, is the piece that for me, as a first-time reader, I was not sure, is this Moiraine overstating the case? Because, we don't know how Lan feels about his quest. We've never been in his head. Or is she right? Is Lan literally the kind of person who is looking to die because his kingdom has died, right? I think you and I both assumed Lan wants this destiny and is riding at some point towards trying to reclaim the throne he has lost. But I think Moiraine is kind of telling us that's not Lan's story. Lan's story is being broken by the loss of the crown, and Moiraine seems more worried about him throwing his life away than actually going on the actual quest. So to me, that's the mystery here, is how much of this is Moiraine potentially misreading Lan, and how much of it is that the Lan we've seen is Lan with Moiraine, and Lan without Moiraine would be a lot more fatalistic. I just don't know that at this point in the series.
Well, and then to throw Nynaeve and Lan's relationship into that mix too, like, is that something that spoils that fatalism that she's afraid of, right? Would he continue to live? Would he bond himself to her? Not in that same way, but, get married, have a bunch of weird blight babies, or what have you. So I do, that's really interesting to me that, and again, so much of this chapter is about how deep their relationship is, and that she's specifically reminding him of that. And so, like you're saying, that's her way of kind of spinning him into, well, what are you doing and what's going on here? So yeah.
Actually, slightly before that, I just wanted to see whether you had any thoughts or whether you enjoyed the scene where we get some kind of hints at Lan and Moiraine's origin. Obviously, this hits differently for someone who has read the prequel, but I just didn't know if those scenes did anything for you, or whether it was kind of like, okay, these are fun hints, nothing else there.
I mean, so in my notes here, I just wrote the word reminiscing. My hometown, I come from New Hampshire. I don't know if I've shared that on the podcast. And in New Hampshire, we have a holiday called Old Home Day, originally invented in the late 19th century because everybody moved away. And so the towns needed money. So they invited everybody back. And so it's a like day festival with dorky parades and all the good stuff. But there's a funny thing in the afternoon where at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you can go to the center of town, and they invite different elderly citizens every year to just share memories, and it's called
Okay.
reminiscences. And like it gathers a huge crowd. There'll be like 50 people sitting in chairs, and they'll be like, Old Man Smith's farm, and everybody in the crowd will be like, oh yes, 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 I know that farm.
That's awesome.
And so I honestly, when I throw that word out, it's like that spirit,
Yeah.
that attitude is what I attach to that word, which is like a kind of nostalgia, but not really the like deep pain that nostalgia can be. More
Mm.
just like that affirmation of like, yeah, that's who we are, and that's how we got there. But I do think Moiraine is bringing it up in order to manipulate, and
Yeah.
not necessarily with the worst connotations of that word. Manipulate being to help to adjust somebody's actions, not necessarily to do it in a negative way.
Yeah.
So I feel like, this is when your college roommate's like, let's just chat about old times. Hey, can I borrow $5,000? I'm in some trouble,
Yeah.
or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
it's something like that where the real ask is coming, and I think some of that harder conversation is coming there. But that's kind of all I took those moments as.
I think that's totally reasonable. I think the very smart move that Moraine pulls is that she, is like, hey, let's reminisce. And then she's like, hey, can I have $5,000? And then she's like, hey, can I have 15 grand? Right. There's a bigger ask after the first ask. Because
Yeah.
once they get through the conversation about the passing of the bond, Moraine almost like goes on the offensive and starts really picking apart Lan's motivations for why he was helping Rand the way he was. And I thought that was really interesting, in particular, just because we know Nynaeve and Lan kind of hashed out the conversation around that, days after it happened. And so the fact that Moraine and Lan hasn't really stuck out to me as like, whoa, it's been a while. He probably wasn't expecting this to come up at all, ever, right? It seems like they haven't talked about their meeting in 20 years. So this was pretty out of left field. I'm curious both your thoughts on the direction of that conversation, and then also potentially, Moraine's strategy of kind of piling the bad news on top of bad to figure out exactly where Lan is at.
Well, in all of that conversation piece, it really felt to me like I was thinking of the Jedi with no attachments, right?
Yeah.
And it's like Moraine seems desperate that Lan have no attachments, that whatever this grand plan is, or no emotional attachments, because she needs him driven by purpose into this fight to come, on her side, doing what she says. And I think, I think that's a really faulty thing about the Jedi, and that's the point of the prequels. But people who hate the prequels kind of don't understand that it was supposed to be bad, right? Like that it's not like an idea that we should all aspire to. It's like, no, it's a faulty piece of dogma there. So I don't know exactly where I land in that regard, right? So it does seem like, to do his job well, he doesn't need to have attachments, and I'd like to believe, Moiraine, that there's a greater good. But if you're asking somebody to sacrifice that much, I mean, that's a huge ask. And also, just again, because she's not being totally forthcoming, I'm suspicious of it.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's right, especially because I don't think Moraine ever actually brings up Nynaeve to Lan in this conversation, right? That's clearly what she's trying to get at and pick at and indirectly find out about. But I think it was a couple of episodes ago, you said something like, well, if these characters would just talk, the book would be over. Boy, is that true of this chapter in particular, right? This seems like this all could have been hashed out a week and a half ago if someone would just say some words. Get used to that.
Well, and it's real. Oh, okay. Oh, good. I mean, I just came off of a podcast I was listening to about Andor, which they're still talking about Andor, which tells you how great it was. But they were talking about how so much of the frustration of that show is like, people should just talk to each other. I'm like, that's every show and that's every book, right? And so I certainly am
that's
not
most
overly
lives.
frustrated by that. Yeah, fair. So I think what's really curious there is, just to preview our next piece of conversation, is the next chapter is so much about Nynaeve getting tested and breaking
Yep.
her attachments. And so there's this mirroring effect from one to the other. And now I'm in just a Star Wars mood. It does feel like, when we see Obi-Wan kind of trying to do some basic teaching to Luke, it's like, oh, these are the things I can do on my own that model and replicate what would have been done at the academy. And it feels very much like that. Like, not that I think Lan is about to become a Sedai or anything, but it's like, oh, let me just test in these same ways because I don't have the fancy tools of the academy.
Yeah, and even just earlier when you were saying that's a really big ask of Moiraine to Lan, there's literally a conversation in the next chapter where Nynaeve is like, this is a really big ask, and Sheriam's like, yep, it is. So I think you're right to say these two chapters have a lot of really interesting parallels, kind of thematically, and then also in terms of kind of the conflicts of our characters. You have any last thoughts on Moiraine and Lan before we move on to Moiraine and Vandene and all of the books?
No, I think my notes move on to that. And this is certainly the part I was referencing when I said it felt like Gandalf, right? It's kind of picking out these little things. Her questioning was, I think, the most interesting part of that, and these kind of snippets of songs and so on that get brought up was really fun. I am in the middle of teaching my students research right now. It's going terribly, but
teaching
I
research to undergrads is going badly. Really? How?
Oh my God. It's like they don't believe me when I say don't just Google and give me the crap that comes up first. And yet that's what they do. So, yeah. So it had that kind of fun resonance of somebody who's a researcher and, tracking down little snippets. And my academic training is in literature. And this is what I did is, so I studied poetry that circulated in colonial newspapers. So I would download like 6 weeks worth of a newspaper and see which ones had poems in them, and then look for little phrases or little snippets that were of interest to my project. It's like, oh, this one mentions liberty. I'm going to pull this one down and this one. And so it very much was like, oh God, am I in grad school again? Like, how did this happen? But it also had that kind of warm nostalgia of like, I did like that work. That's kind of why I went into academia, was that kind of fun. And to see a character do it has that kind of romance to it.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I love about the world Robert Jordan has built, right? Is it's very clear Robert Jordan loves learning things and reading, and he has built a world where everyone loves learning things and reading. And that's just nice and warm and fuzzy and feels like home a little bit to me. I kind of want to break this conversation with Vandene down question by question, point of discussion by point of discussion, even if most of them will be pretty quick, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
We begin with an interesting conversation about the way of what is going on in the world. And in particular, we hear more about the multiple false dragons, and we learn that Mazrim Taim, the false dragon, I believe in Saldia, if I recall, is still running loose, and it seems that Vandene is quite upset about it. When Moiraine is asked to respond to that, her response is, I wouldn't worry about Taim, which is kind of fun and telling. Did you pick up anything in the news of the world section that you think is interesting or worth discussing?
No, not really. Again, it seems like there's a concerted effort to put a lot of static out into the world.
Yeah.
And I mean that on the part of Robert Jordan. Like, he creates a lot of static. Is it Nate Silver who says the signal and the noise?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of noise happening, and Moiraine is tracing the signal within that, which would be the actual strands that matter within this kind of mishmash of noise that's coming through. So I think a lot of times when we get that kind of update on this, it's like, of note, oh, even more false dragons, things are escalating, but I think of it all as noise because we know the real person to be following.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so then the first question that Moiraine asks is about the link between the dragon and the Horn of Valir, and she is told there is no link except for the fact that both of them will be present at the last battle, which she refers to as Tarman Gaidan, which I mostly want to mention simply because the echo to Armageddon is just far enough off that you might miss it if you don't think of it on first glance. Any thoughts about why Moiraine might be thinking about the dragon and the horn, or anything in the answer that kind of bumped for you or got you excited?
Um, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to note that the other night at Dungeons and Dragons, you wore a shirt that said that
That is
word.
correct. Yes.
That is correct. And you said I finally understood your whole shirt. So I have unlocked an achievement. Like, whoop, there it goes. And so then, obviously there, what stood out to me is I feel like the thing that's gone wrong is still the Forsaken from Shadar Logoth. And obviously we'll talk more about that in a moment. And so Moiraine, I assumed, was trying to track why is Rand stuck following the horn, right? Like is it the horn, is it the dagger, like what's going on there? She's trying to like disentangle those threads of the signal to try to determine what's going on there. And again, it does feel, we've talked so often about the Melville loom, like this baton came down and smashed the weaving in a really weird way this time, and that's the chance. And so she's trying to say, okay, is it just chance or is there something more there? So so then knowing that, these are less united pieces that will come together and more just things that will be present, didn't stand out to me as terribly important.
Cool. Yeah, fair enough. Second question. Is there a link between the dragon and Tomon Head? She is told this is actually something of an academic dispute. She discusses a quotation that says, above the watchers, he proclaims himself bannered across the sky. And she says that the translation of the word watchers is a bit odd in a way that might suggest that it is the watchers over the waves on Tomon Head. So I think this is an interesting link because we've already heard so much about Tomon Head in this book. What did you make of this other than just the Leo DiCaprio pointing at the screen meme?
Well, and a double of that where I was also just like, that's the chapter name, right? Yeah. So there's kind of this signal that like this might be more important than before. I do like when there's a little wordplay. It is funny when an author does it with fake language, because you're like, oh, okay, but you could, like, it's also gleep glop gloop or whatever,
right?
Like, so it's not quite as clever as I don't know, something like Tom Riddle becoming I am Lord Voldemort or something like that. But that's really to me it just is more confirmation that that's where we're going. Like, get ready in the back half of the book. I think we're headed to Toman's Head. And we have heard previously about these people who went across the sea, right? And that they're coming back. That sounds to me like people who'd be watching over the waves. Or, it could be people over the sea or what have you.
Yeah, I think this was actually Varen had maybe made a reference to this in the previous kind of lore dump chapter we had gotten like 10 chapters ago or so. She mentioned the Watchers over the waves were people who were waiting for the return of Hawkwing's armies across the ocean. So that link is exactly correctly drawn. The third question, Moiraine kind of asks generally about Shadar Logoth. It doesn't seem like we get a whole lot of new information here, but I thought it was effective by Jordan of just kind of getting all of that information back in your head. Did anything in that discussion jump out at you, or did you have the same kind of reaction I was? It was mostly kind of recap.
Mostly recap, but the reaction of Van Dien matters, because it was like, what on earth are you asking about that? Which is again confirmation that this is not supposed to be a part of the pattern as we head towards the final battle. And so whatever has happened here by accident is really skewing things in a way that is totally unexpected to somebody who seems very knowledgeable about the prophecies and such.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fourth and final question, I think, is probably the most telling one. Moiraine first asks about the Forsaken, is given a very generic answer, and then clarifies she is specifically asking about the Forsaken Lanfear. And we have actually heard about Lanfear, again, in that previous chapter where Moiraine and Varen and the Amerlin seat were kind of breaking down some of the dark prophecy. Lanfear, it was said, is one of the more powerful female Forsaken, and that she specifically was in love with Lews Therin Telamon in the previous age. And so Moiraine asking about that specific individual really kind of jumped out at me. Did you either make the connection to the previous discussion, or what was your thought about this discussion of Lanfear, one of the more feared of the Forsaken?
Did not remember the previous conversation. My notes just go, oh, dark, mysterious female. we've met one of those recently, so
That is correct.
that's where my mind went. Yeah, so clearly we've been joking for a few episodes now about how she seems to be really playing games and troublesome, and I think this is just confirmation that we should be even more afraid of her than we thought.
Yeah, at this.
And you
Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say you zoom back and forth here. But you recently had me uploading the cover images again to match the episode description. And it was a reminder that in that discussion, I don't think we really talked about like the promotion of Celine to cover status, right?
Yeah.
Which fantasy books often just have a nice tableau, but it's like, oh, like when I was reading this and then doing that posting, I was like, oh, right. Like, it means a lot probably that she's there. And so I'm curious to see where that goes.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing now is, as you were saying before, this is all about signal and noise. What's the important stuff? What's the unimportant stuff? The kind of remaining dangling question, I think, is Celine Lanfear, or is Lanfear a really good red herring for Robert Jordan to be throwing out at this moment, right? That's kind of where we're left. As far as I'm concerned, there's not really much else we can glean from this. So once we get past that, it's action, 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 stabby, stabby, stabby. I don't have much to say about that. Did you have any thoughts on kind of the ending of this chapter, or where Moiraine and Lan end up?
So just recapping it and making sure I have my notes correct. So they get attacked by the drag car. And it really, like, essentially Moiraine should have died, right?
Yeah.
Is part of the stabby. I just saw Scream, and you just summarized Scream as well. So, I mean, this is timeless, and the movie Scream 6 definitely didn't just come out. But this thought that the Black Aja must have shielded her. And so this is somebody sicked this group on this cabin, but particularly didn't want Moiraine killed. That's how we should interpret that?
So I think what it is the reason Moiraine came so close to dying is because the drag car was cloaked. We've learned in kind of previous chapters.
Must have shielded them.
Yeah. So we've seen in previous chapters that both Moiraine and Lan can sense when darkspawn are near. And so this was likely some Aes Sedai doing something to stop them from having that sense of it before it got too close. So this is the suspicion that one of the Dark Friends wanted them to die.
I see. So yes, you're correcting my misinterpretation of my notes. So I thank you for that. And obviously suspect number one on that list is Sus Aes Sedai, who's been following them and we know has taken off, whose name is
Liandrin.
Yep.
I would also just because this is how mysteries work. I think we've got 3 Aes Sedai in the room, so we should also probably not Moiraine. We were in her head, but Vandene and Adelias should probably both potentially be on the "Are they in the Black Aja" checklist.
And certainly, are they reacting to whatever questions they overheard or were asked directly, depending which it was?
Exactly.
Cool. All right. That sounds good.
So that is what we have on chapter 22. So barring you shouting something and stopping me, we should jump into chapter 23, the testing, which begins with Nynaeve being led into a subterranean chamber beneath the White Tower. She's being guided by Sheriam, the mistress of novices. And there's a large device that seems to have 3 arches, and they are glowing with some sort of magical energy. And Sheriam explains this is a ter'angreal that can be used to test individuals when they come to become accepted. We get a brief lecture about ter'angreal, including one really interesting one that we will be talking about in more detail. But then we learn basically that women who get to this point, A, sometimes disappear, and B, either have to go through with it or they will be sent out forever. Nynaeve eventually decides that she is going through with it, mostly because she wants to get back at Moiraine, and then she steps through the first of the arches. When she does, she is still naked. We're also going to have to talk about why she had to be naked. And then she is walking through a maze where she is confronted by Agenor, and they get into a fight with the One Power, and she has to flee through a silver arch when she could have killed Agenor. When she emerges, she has water poured over her. She has completed the first of the steps, and when she speaks to Sheriam, she mentioned that she channeled, and Sheriam says that shouldn't be possible. Well, you probably won't remember that I told you this. You shouldn't channel in there if you can avoid it. At this point, Nynaeve goes through the second of the arches, and she emerges in Emond's Field, but she immediately notices that things are looking run down and nothing seems well repaired. First, she sees Sen Bui, who is shocked to see her, and then she sees Egwene's mother, who starts to tell her about all of the horrible things that the new wisdom has been doing. She's been browbeating the women, she's been taking over politics, she's been poisoning children, she's been killing adults. It's real rough. And just as Nynaeve is saying that she is going to help and the new wisdom is arriving, she has to pull herself away and abandon her people in order to go through the arch. She emerges once again in the basement of the White Tower. She is drenched in water again. She is mad at Sheriam, and this is the conversation we referenced earlier where she says, "You asked too much," and Sheriam says, "Nope, it's exactly the right amount." Nynaeve then goes through the arch for the third time. She enters a fantasy land in which Lan is a Melchiori king. She is married to him, and their children are apparently A, existing, and B, thrilled to have her home. She repeatedly tries to deny that this is real. She clearly kind of thinks that she won't be able to deny it if she ever accepts it. And for just a moment, it seems like she does, and the archway seems to vanish. And at this point, Nynaeve kind of starts to panic, and she starts reaching for the power, and it almost seems like she uses the power to reopen the gateway and then steps through it. When she does, she emerges in the White Tower for the last time, and this time it is the Merlin who drenches her in water and says that she is now bound to the White Tower, which of course is very unsettling for Nynaeve. So I think you're right to say that this is definitely the more plot-centric of the two chapters, but it's also a really interesting one because the plot is really kind of motivated by what's going on internally for Nynaeve. So I'm curious what your overall impression of this chapter was that simultaneously to me feels like a character chapter and a plot chapter.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun. It's something very different, as I noted, and yet it falls in a familiar archetype. I obviously thought about in Star Wars, there's Luke facing the test on Dagobah and Rey in the Mirror Cave. And it felt very much like one of those. As we've said before on the podcast, we're both huge fans of Good Place, and there's a really good episode of Good Place where they all get tested to see if they can go to the good place. We'll leave it pretty vague because that show's so good, people shouldn't have it spoiled.
But Chidi's test is the
and
best.
so it. Oh, that's true. Fair enough. Fair enough. And so all of that just feels like, this is part of mythology, right? It's crossing a threshold and facing down a guardian. It was also, kind of fun to pick apart what the three were and that they were each so difficult. For a moment, it did in some ways almost feel like the three ghosts from Christmas Carol, right? Like past, present, but elsewhere in the world, essentially, and then future, but it wasn't quite future. It would seem it was kind of potential future or something. But there were just a couple hints in the language of the chapter, and I'll throw it back to you on this, where it was kind of it was hinted at, I thought, that it's like, oh, these aren't just like magic visions. These actually could be other planes. And given that we just spent a bunch of time on a different plane of existence, like these are potentialities that are out there, and that's what multiverse storytelling is.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is that the chapter actually begins with Sheriam telling us, like, we really don't understand ter'angreal that well at all, right? She says the people who study them often burn themselves out or, lose the ability to channel or whatever happens to them. And so this idea that these Aes Sedai are kind of messing with things they don't entirely understand what they do, but they get people go in, they have experiences, they come out. It kind of shows us how much has been lost, right? It's very likely that I think you're right, that in the Age of Legends, this was probably a multiversal travel device that these Aes Sedai are like, well, we could use it to test girls because it takes them to places related to their past, present, and future. And that's scary to think about. The biggest collection of power in the universe, that's their level of understanding of some of these devices they're using.
Again, we want this to be timeless, but I'm also thinking of a recent episode of Mandalorian where they had a torture device that the Empire used, and they were like, "Oh, don't worry, we just dial it down, and it's a safe, helpful, therapeutic device now." It feels like that. Like we have something kind of crazy powerful, but we'll just dial it down and test you to, the core of your being.
Given that, I actually want to now talk about an object that is only mentioned in passing, but the implications of it for our understanding of at least one character is really, really huge. So you're talking about these Aes Sedai using things potentially not for their intended purpose, or taking huge things and, applying them in really odd ways. The only ter'angreal that we learn about in this chapter, other than the arches, is said to be a rod that can make someone's oaths binding. And we learn that all of the Aes Sedai take 3 oaths that are bound to them. And I want to at least take a moment to acknowledge this, because it's pretty earth-shattering stuff from the perspective of how are the Aes Sedai limited. We are told in this chapter that the Aes Sedai take 3 oaths. That to speak no word that is not true, to make no weapon for one man to kill another, and to never use the one power as a weapon except against dark friends or shadow spawn, or in the last extreme of defending your own life. And in particular, I want to note the first one. Moiraine can't lie. He never has in a book and a half.
Wow, I totally missed that. That is interesting. Okay. So in all her seeming duplicity, she's relying on half-truths and omissions, but never actually lying.
Yes, and I think the perfect example of this comes in the previous chapter, when Van Dien brings up Mazrim Taim. Moiraine doesn't say he's not the dragon, because that would reveal that she knows who the dragon is. Moiraine doesn't say, don't worry, it's not a problem, because she doesn't know it's not a problem. What she says is, would I be here if the dragon was running around out there? Right? That is an Aes Sedai answer, right? She literally cannot lie, so she finds a way to tell the truth that gets around it. So while this is a very tiny thing in this chapter, I think lore-wise, it's huge. You said you didn't notice it. What are your thoughts now as you're kind of thinking through the implications of this other object that we didn't see but heard about?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I'm thinking also of the bonding last chapter and how that is also, potentially how that's achieved. But it certainly feels more like confirmation that we were right to kind of always side with Moiraine a little bit, right? Like, I mean, that's valorous, right? It's we trust characters who are honest. It's an upstanding value. And so she is bound to never lie. That's cool. And I want to go back and check some of her, particular speeches where she'd be kind of hiding things. But I also think that tells me that it is still good to be trusting her, which that feels good.
I think this puts a lot of context on one of the things that Tam told us at the beginning of the first book, when he told Rand, trust what she says, but don't always trust she's saying what you think she is. And I think now that we know that is literally true, it kind of highlights why Tam was saying it, but it also highlights why in the world didn't Tam just say that she can't lie? Like, tell your kid the actual thing. Direct communication with your children. That's what this podcast is really about. Unless you have other
you mean the podcast I come to my basement for to ignore my children. Yeah, that's what this podcast is about. I don't have any other thoughts about that. I think that's very cool, and I'm excited to learn more about it and watch it as we move forward.
Excellent. So before we then dive into the actual test itself, I just had 2 really tiny things that I wanted to kind of pull out and, just very briefly discuss. The first is Nynaeve's motivation for wanting to go through the test, which seems to be, I hate Moiraine, I'll do anything to punish her. What did you think about that kind of being the underlying motive there?
I mean, it's not like I ever thought they were buddies, but it has felt like that is only escalated more and more since they've been apart. And,
Yeah.
well, I think social media makes me do that to people. I'm like, I hate you. I hate you. You're awful. You're awful. And then I hang out with the person. I'm like, oh, okay. You're not so bad. But there's a
Yeah.
little of that dynamic going on here where it's like, I think she's remembering the worst of them and the worst of her and
Yeah.
the worst of their interactions and their rivalry and so on. And so I think it's still, even that being said, it is surprising that she's becoming so, maniacal about
Yeah.
getting that revenge and proving her wrong. But we all have rivals in our lives. Mine's named Tylor.
I
Different
understand.
Tylor.
Sure it is. I understand you wanted to do a podcast to top me at it. I get it. The other really small note I had here is, in order to do this ceremony, Nynaeve needs to get naked. And my response to that in my notes is a little star that said, Jordan's trying. I think he was trying to like evoke like a lot of like ancient pagan rites where nudity was common. I think he was trying to reference. I think there were even some like early like church ceremonies that were often performed with like minimal or no clothing, but I don't think it works super well. It comes off as that like 90s I'm trying to be tittillating thing that just has never ever ever worked for me. Did that bump for you? Did you have any thoughts about it? I don't know.
Here's my 20-minute thesis on nudity in it. No, it is a what came to mind was Game of Thrones, just because nudity and fantasy, and I think when George R. R. Martin wrote those books, he had, as I understand it, he had just come off a television show. Was it Beauty and the Beast? That awful
Sounds
90s
right.
show, and so he said something like, "I'm gonna make the most unfilmable fantasy ever," and that's why he resorted to the extreme violence and the nudity and the sex and all that, and then they filmed it because it's not TV, it's HBO. It does feel like you're saying kind of edgy to try to be edgy, but even in my mind right now, I haven't seen the show. I don't know if the show is in the show yet, but it screams to me like Simpsons nudity, where there's always just that thing blocking the view. Like, yes, here she is behind an Aes Sedai who's standing with their shoulder cocked in just the right position or whatever. And so I think that's not the brand, which is what you're saying and what I'm mumbling my way through. But it's okay to try, but let's just stick to the brand.
No, totally. I 100% agree with that. I'll be honest, all three of these kind of vision scenes, I don't have a lot of notes on, because this is the kind of like directly moving the plot forward that I have a harder time with when there aren't kind of a lot of character thoughts or discussion in between the action. So I just kind of want to throw to you, what was your overall impression of the first of the three visions, running through a maze confronted by Agenor? What were your takeaways?
I mean, it felt like I said, this was the one that felt a little Ghost of Christmas Past, right? Like not that she'd been in a maze, but that she had a regret, essentially. And so it kind of psychologically working through that regret. And then this comes after the vision. I think, to me, the real takeaway from this is that she channeled in the plane, and that it's clear that shouldn't have been possible, and then we see her do it again. So that confrontation was not exactly thrilling, but recognizing that Rand is still on her mind, right? Her kind of protector role around Rand. I think that's what she needed to face, that kind of moment in those regrets, and needed to let that go in order to carry on.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, this is just Robert Jordan kind of showing us the rules in a relatively simple situation before he puts us in the ones where he actually has some, really interesting things to say about the character. So I'm kind of in the same place. It's interesting that she can channel. I think we maybe want to start in our like mystery basket. How could she, or why could she, or is there something different or unique about her? But setting that aside, it's a well-written scene, but I don't think there's a ton to go to there. So then I'm curious about the second of the visions, where my big note is a question: is this real? And Sheriam gives the answer, probably not. I don't think so. But none of that disproves the possibility that this could be what's happening in the Two Rivers right now. So, what are your thoughts both on kind of the possibility that this is actually what's happening and or where Ninety finds herself in the challenge she's faced with?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked before about Joseph Campbell's formulation that you have to leave the concerns of the home behind in order to go out into the strange new realm. And this is exactly that test, right?
Yeah.
This is when you left those concerns of home, it fell apart. And, the part of Lord of the Rings that the movies edited out was that the Shire fell apart when the hobbits left, and they had to win the Shire back at the return.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that those movies didn't need any more. But I do
That is
think that's
correct.
an important part.
Yeah, I was going to say the raising of the Shire is one of my favorite parts of the book, even though you are correct. They needed to take it out of that movie. It already had 12 endings. So number 13 was unnecessary.
Well, and like, can you imagine if they suddenly added in like another half hour?
Oh my God.
Like people would have rioted in the streets. So absolutely the right choice in adaptation, but I do think it's an important part of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And I imagine we will someday eventually get back to Two Rivers and see not literally the same thing, but that there has been a cost, and that it goes back to Odysseus. Odysseus doesn't get home, and his wife, plants a wet smooch and they go to bed. It's like, oh crap, she's got 19 dudes living in my hall, and I gotta test her and test my son and test my dog and test my dad, and then eventually win over the home with a big bloody massacre. So I imagine, so all that is, I don't think we're supposed to know whether it's real or not, because the explanation went to it could be real somewhere. I leaned more towards it's probably the real deal in my head anyway, or equivalent to whatever's happening there.
Yeah, I think that actually then works pretty well to transition us into the next scene, which is Nynaeve asking about A, whether it's real, but then B, she says, you demand too much. How can you ask this? And Sheriam's response is basically, look, if you are going to be controlling world-shattering power, we've got to know that you are dedicated to us and our mission. And so I think this really, to me, highlighted in a way that the previous Egwene chapter had maybe like hinted at, but not really solidified. The Aes Sedai don't just see themselves as like a center of power. They see themselves in some way as protecting the world from, unrestrained or poor use of the power. So I'm curious what your thought was, just in answer to Nynaeve's question. Is this too much to ask?
We know the history of the Aes Sedai is gentling all the men who have this talent. So it's not like I thought they didn't take this power seriously, and that they were really careful guardians or shepherds of this power. So I think it doesn't surprise me. And, again, because this is such a familiar kind of archetypal scene, it's like, yeah, you have to let go of everything. And the failure of the nudity is really, and the water, it's all just a reminder of rebirth and symbolism around baptism and so on. And, I think this is what we really ask of the heroes, as it tends to be. It's like they have to be stripped down and broken down of everything, and that's when they can start to rise. So I think it's fair to take the power seriously. I'm always skeptical of any institution, so it's like, but do they have to do this? Probably not. But I am okay with them being cautious before handing somebody the keys to the nuclear codes.
And it's worth noting, we were talking, I think in the last episode or maybe the one before, how Andor is very much kind of an analog to medieval England, and Carrion is very much kind of medieval France. The White Tower very obviously feels Vatican-y if we're putting things into that same kind of positioning. And so I think that's right to be thinking about like baptism, and then also, kind of church or organizational hierarchy, and how much is that solving problems versus how much is it just creating infrastructure that, if we're going to talk about institutions being flawed, the Catholic Church is a pretty good one to start with. No offense to all my Catholic friends, but it's true.
It
So
is. I've never heard this. Start from the beginning. Yeah. Speaking as two guys in Boston, this is a part of our reality.
yes.
Every day when we look around and see all the damaged people around us. So, yeah, and I think that complicates the picture of Moiraine, right? Like
Yeah.
it's also we're like, oh, always trust her. She never lies, but also like, hey, like she's committed to a power. Although there's also the fact that she and the Amerlin seat are working outside of the power of the tower, outside the bureaucracy. So yeah, it's a complicated picture in a good way.
Yeah. And I love me some complicated pictures. That's why I love series that are 15 books long. The last of the visions, I think, is the most effectively drawn. And to some degree, that I think that's why I have a little bit less to say about it, is it's really heartbreaking to see Nynaeve denying what she wants because she knows she can't deny it once she gives into it. And I don't have anything to add to it. It's just well done.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if the concentric circles get down to the personal here, right? And it's like, yeah, these are the things that cost her the most and were deepest within her, and the secret wishes she doesn't even allow herself to vocalize are visual here, and she still has to reject it. And
Yeah.
everything we just said again, right? That's what kind of we ask of our heroes. They lose the self in order to save the communal, and she lost her community in Vision 2, her original community, and now loses herself here. And I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like pure vengeance can really justify that. So to say, okay, now how is she going to be committed to this cause? I'm curious to see if she is changed by these experiences, because we don't really see anything else of that.
And I think that's actually why I find the final sequence to be so effective, is because we finally see, I think, in the last of the three visions, we see Nynaeve reach a point that I think you're exactly right. She might give up, being able to destroy Aginor, or maybe even leaving the two rivers. But the fact that, as you say, she kind of gives up her identity herself to some degree, and then immediately is greeted by a woman saying, "You belong to us now." That's got to feel like a little bit of buyer's remorse, if nothing else, from Nynaeve. And so I think that tension between the end of the previous scene and then the final sequence of this chapter, it works really effectively because of exactly what you're describing. What was your takeaway from that last sequence?
I mean, chilling, right? And there's language there that there's darkness emanating from the Amerlin seat, and there's just that feeling. I still haven't made up my mind. I understand she's a deep ally of Moiraine, so that should mean I trust her, but it's a complicated picture, and I could use, I don't know, 12 more books to work it out.
I am happy to give that to you. Just give me like 5 or 6 years. No big deal. Where I'm left at the end of this chapter, I think, is just excited to see where this goes. I think Robert Jordan did a really smart thing of kind of starting us in the middle of the curriculum to some degree. So we're almost getting to see where Egwene is going to end up before we actually see her starting there, while also getting Nynaeve at the beginning of her story. What are your thoughts about where we go from here as we're now kind of leaving the chapter? Do you have any hopes or expectations, or where do you think we go now that, as you said, these are two very different chapters from what we've seen before?
It feels like we're starting to get some real momentum. We talked before how we made the turn from recap into new material, but this feels like, okay, let's really start establishing. We had the section where we moved everybody or set everybody on a course, and now we're headed into really big, deep things. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to reading more. It's a little late, so I probably won't go read them now, but I will certainly dive in with glee as we move into this back half of the book. Before I throw it to you to close the show, I did just want to put in one selfish plug, which is last time we recorded, or 2 weeks ago when we recorded, we had a conversation and I offhandedly said something about why is all our storytelling right now about multiverses? And I wrote about it. I actually reignited my blog, which is now to be found at ioncanon.com. And you can find my blog there and see what I ended up writing about it just before Everything Everywhere All at Once, one best picture. So, yeah, thanks for the inspiration. You
Of
did get
course.
credit, but not by name.
Excellent. Just because many of the people who listen to this podcast might not follow you immediately on Twitter, that is EYEONCANNON or CANON. No, not two N's, correct? Canon.
That's correct. It's
Okay.
canon like books, not canon like a gun. So thank you for that reminder. Yes, I think that's in our outro, though, isn't it?
Oh, it may
We'll
be.
see.
Yeah, we'll
Maybe
find out.
Maybe I just revealed I haven't listened to the outro in 6 months. Hey, take us out of the show, Tyler.
Well, next week, first off, I'm going to make Greg listen to the outro at least once. And then we are going to be talking about chapter 24, New Friends and Old Enemies, and chapter 25, Carrie N. And for those of you who, like me, like to look ahead, you will note that at least one of the chapters isn't Rand, which makes me smile. And we will have some ill-advised discussion of visual media for you next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.